Okay, this is a nigun that came to me when I was on the top of Mount Meron early in the morning, looking out over the entire Galilee, all the way to Har Hermon, and uh, the whole Galil was had mist. It was the most mystical experience. It was just so gorgeous, and this nigun just came down. Okay, so before we start, I just want to tell everyone there's someone here named Renee, and she asked me and everyone else to daven for her, that her neighborhood is having some problems, and want to bless you that Hashem should come to your aid, and you should be safe, and everything should work out good. Okay, this is Parshat Bo, and last week, the first 7 of the 10 plagues occurs. And in this week's Parsha, the last 3 plagues. And at the end of the Parsha, we actually are getting ready to go out of Egypt. Pharaoh has relented after the killing of the firstborn, and we're about to leave Egypt. And the first commandments of how to prepare to leave, and the rudiments of the holiday of Pesach, of matzah and everything that goes along with Pesach. So we're going to concentrate on one idea here, because there's something that connects all 3 plagues together. The 8th plague is locust. And it says that the locusts were so thick that they blocked out the sun. They covered the whole heavens, and it turned dark. The 9th plague is darkness itself. It lasted for a whole week. And it said that the darkness was so, it's hard to come up with the right adjective, it was so thick that if someone was sitting down, they couldn't stand up. And if someone was standing up, they couldn't sit down. In other words, people were frozen in their places. And then the last plague, the killing of the firstborn, happens at midnight, which is the darkest time of the night. So the idea of darkness connects all the last three plagues. And poetically, this is true also. The phrase, the darkest hour is just before the dawn. Right before redemption, it got increasingly dark. So we want to look at light and darkness in this context. And the Rabbi of Slonim, the Nativat Shalom, so he makes a very, very interesting observation, because in the Torah, it describes the ninth plague, the darkness, and then it says, but in all of the dwellings of Israel, there was light. So the question is how did this work? If it was dark everywhere, how was there light in the house of the Jews? So he says something very, very amazing. And he says that actually there was light everywhere. But if someone is not used to light, then it appears to them as darkness. We're going to look at this statement. Everyone hold that statement, this idea that sometimes too much light, the expression is blinded by the light. There's so much light that the result or the experience is, I can't see. It's as if it's dark. And here we're right before the redemption. So the Slonim Rebbe was saying there was light in the houses of all the Jews because the redemption was coming. But for the Egyptians, they experienced this as darkness. So we're going to contrast light and darkness for a few minutes here. So first of all, to go back to the plague of darkness, one way we can relate to this is the darkness of depression. Everyone has to deal with some forms of depression. No one is happy all the time. Everyone experiences ups and downs. Some people are very challenged with this, and depression becomes chronic and it becomes very serious. But I don't think there's anyone who doesn't experience those days that aren't full of light, that we're challenged, we have questions, we feel stressed, we have problems in our life that are overwhelming us. But when someone is experiencing depression, it's like the Torah describes, that sometimes you just can't get out of bed. And that's how the Torah describes this. If people were sitting, they couldn't stand up. And if they were standing, they couldn't sit down. Depression has this effect of, in a sense, freezing us that we can't act. But when we look at darkness in general, our initial reaction is of negativity. When we contrast light and darkness, usually we think of light as holiness, spirituality, pureness, godliness, everything good. And sometimes when we think of darkness, it's evil, and it's negativity, and it's hiding. And there is a truth to that. There is a certain truth to that. But what we want to explore is the positive aspects of darkness, because not all darkness is negative. So if you give me 1 second. Okay, sorry. I want to read you in English from one of the Psalms. It says like this. This is from the, if anyone wants to look it up later, it's from the 18th Psalm, the 12th verse. And it says like this: if I ascend into heaven, there you are. If I make my bed in hell, behold, there you are. If I say, surely only darkness will cover me, and the light be night about me, even the darkness is not dark for you, for God, but the night shines like the day. The darkness and the light are both alike to you. So this description is that there is an aspect of darkness that we do associate with negativity, sadness, evil, and all of that. Darth Vader and the war of the forces of light versus the forces of darkness. We have these images, and there is obviously a truth to that. But there's also a different aspect of darkness that we're going to explore a little bit deeper. So the question is asked on the first day of creation, is darkness just an absence of light? In other words, if there was no light, would there be no darkness? And is darkness just an emptiness caused by a lack of light? So again, in one aspect, that's true, but there's a much deeper aspect. If we look at the Torah, light was created on the third verse of the Torah, light is created. But if we look at the second verse already, darkness is already mentioned. And we can relate to this as darkness of the womb. When we envision a fetus in a womb, so really the fetus is in a state of darkness. But this darkness is what is life-giving. This darkness is what allows the baby to come into the world. And in the teachings of the Kabbalah, that first God withdrew his infinite essence, the Tzimtzum, he contracted his infinite essence. And what was left was, in a sense, a dark vacuum. And into this vacuum, God shone a ray of light. And from that ray of light comes all of creation. So this is very much like the image of the womb. At first there had to be darkness, and from this darkness comes light. And this is very much like coming out of Egypt. That's why the last 3 plagues are all have to do with darkness, because they're paving the way for the light. And in Kabbalah, there's this idea, and we basically just saw it in the Psalms, that from God's perspective, there's an aspect that darkness and light are different and they're opposite, but there's a level like a triangle. Here's light and here's darkness. But for God, light and dark in the highest level are the same thing. So in other words, there is a darkness that shines, and there's a light that blinds. And so I wanted to give some examples, because this may sound very abstract, but let's take some very, very practical examples where where darkness is actually a very, very positive thing. So we'll start with saying the Shema. The Shema is the cardinal statement of faith, and it's so important to the Jewish people, and it's such an important part of our morning prayers and our evening prayers. The Shema is just central. And yet, when we say the Shema, not only do we close our eyes, but we put our hand over our eyes. It's a double layer of darkness. So you would ask, well, Shema should be so full of light. And here's where the paradox comes in, is that sometimes to see the light, we close our eyes, because that type of darkness shines. So this is a very, very good example. Like I said, not only closing our eyes, but putting our hand over our eyes. And in the book of Deuteronomy, when God is explaining that if the Jewish people turn away from me, I will certainly hide my face. And the language in the Torah is a double language. Hester astir. I will surely hide my face. The word hester astir is the same root. And that is the type of negative darkness, where God, in a sense, we don't feel God's presence. And that is a void. That's like a vacuum that is lacking light. But a fixing for this is saying the Shema, where we do a double hiding, and yet we're looking deep inside, and it's God's oneness is full of light. Another example is when we do the blessing of the Koanim. So the tradition, the custom is not to look at the Koanim while they're blessing the people. And in fact, the Koanim put the talus over their head, and they're not even looking at the people. Their hands are stretched out, but they're not looking at the people, and the people are not looking at them. Why? Is because that moment is so full of light, it would, in a sense, be a distraction to be looking at something physical. The person with their hands out and the talus over their head. As beautiful of an image as that is, we close our eyes and we don't look, is because the moment is so full of light. The way to get to the light is through closing our eyes. And it's the same thing when we're praying. I'm sure many people have the experience that when we're praying, that many times we close our eyes, is because we want to get so deep inside. Having physical images and light actually is, in a sense, dark. We close our eyes in order to contact a much deeper light. And the same thing is when we go to the mikveh, that when we dunk in the mikveh, we close our eyes, because actually in the mikveh it's like returning to the womb. It's a rebirthing process, but to experience it, we go back into the darkness, but that darkness is full of light. And we have also with meditation, for those people who meditate, There are types of meditation where we meditate on what we're learning, or like you see this image back here, like this is actually an amazing meditation in of itself. If you like stare at it, not only is there a Magen David in the middle, but if you see the cubes, they, depending on how you're looking at it, they change perspective. It's like an Escher kind of perspective. But usually when we're meditating, we close our eyes because we're looking for a darkness that shines. And one last example is kissing. We just have an intuitive experience that when we're kissing, we close our eyes because the experience is so deep that we want, again, this type of darkness that shines. Now we'll go back to what the Netivat Shalom said, that for someone who is steeped in negativity or evil or just kind of lost, and they're exposed to something holy and wholesome and beautiful and wonderful, sometimes it's too much for someone, and they actually experience it as the opposite. An example that we can make is Shabbat. Shabbat, numerically, the gematria of the word Shabbat is 702. And the word for light is 207. So if you notice, they're inverse numbers. Shabbat is 702, and light is 207. This is one of the secrets of women lighting candles to usher in the Shabbat. That's how we usher in the Shabbat, is with light. Now, for someone who observes Shabbat, so Shabbat is the most peaceful, beautiful, wonderful, holy, light-filled experience. But let's say you know nothing about Shabbat, you're steeped in Western culture, you've spent your whole life like 24/7. Everything's open all the time. You can get 250 channels on your cable 24 hours a day. And let's say this person is thrown into Shabbat, where you can't do this, and you can't do that, and you can't do this, and you can't do that. For that person, it's like, this is darkness. This is crazy. Like, this is darkness. So that's just an example where you could be confronted with so much light that you experience it as the opposite. So that's what the Slonim Rebbe was saying. How could it be that Egypt, there was darkness everywhere, but for the Jews, there was light? So that's how we started all this. He explained that really there really was darkness, but it really was the light of redemption is about to shine. It's already shining. And if you're an Egyptian who's a slave driver, if you're Pharaoh, if your whole society is based on the backs of your slaves, so if all of a sudden there's all of this light, you're not going to experience it as light. You're going to experience it as darkness. So I want to end with one other idea, because we see that this is very, very paradoxical. So if we go back to creation, So sometimes we refer to God as the infinite one, the Ein Sof. God is many times, especially in Kabbalah, is referred to as the Ein Sof, the infinite one. Now, sometimes we use two different terms, Ein Sof, and sometimes Or Ein Sof, the light, the infinite light, Or HaEin Sof, the infinite light. So the word Ein Sof literally means without end. So on a certain level, Ein, the nothingness, is this darkness that shines. That from God's perspective, there's a level of darkness that shines just like the light, like we said in the 18th Psalm. And then there's the infinite light. And then there is a type of more negative darkness. And then there is light. So there's like four levels. If you follow, there's darkness, and then there's an infinite light. There's an infinite darkness, from which comes an infinite light, from which comes the duality of a finite darkness and a finite light. But the light can be both positive and negative, and the darkness can be both positive and negative. And that's really the idea of like a triangle where you have two opposites, but the idea is always to see how we can unite them. This is the secret of the Magen David. The secret of the Magen David is two interlocking triangles that come together. So I just want to end with two other examples. And maybe this is still fresh in our mind from the lights of Hanukkah. But when you look at a candle up close, you'll see that coming out from the wick is a small blue area surrounded by a black area, and only around that do you have the flame of light. So this is the idea also, again, the idea of the womb, that the light, if you look at a candle from far away, all you see is the light. But when you get close, it's coming from the darkness, actually, from a dark blue and a dark black. And the other example is we say that the Torah is written black fire on white fire. Black fire are the letters of the Torah, and the white fire is the parchment. So if you think about it, we might say, well, why isn't the parchment black and the letters white? Because we think of the Torah as Torah or. We have a verse, Ner mitzvah v'Torah or. A mitzvah is like a candle, and the Torah is light. So you might think this is it's a great secret here, a great paradox that we're saying here. We might think if the Torah is light, so the Torah is the letters, so the letters should be white, and the parchment should be black, but it's just the opposite. The letters are the black fire on the white fire. So when we say Torah or, the Torah is light, these are the letters of the Torah, and they're black. So this is a darkness that can shine. And this becomes a challenge for each of us, because we talked before about the ninth plague of darkness being connected psychologically, emotionally to bouts of depression. That we can relate to darkness as depression. So as we go through life, And this whole series is called Growing Through Exodus. So if we take all of the teachings today, we see that sometimes our life seems to be filled with light. We have experiences of light, and we also have experiences of darkness. So on one level, yes, we have to separate between darkness and light, between good and evil, between what's permitted and what's not permitted. Like we end Shabbos, Hamavdil ben Kodesh lechol, ben Or lechoshech, ben Yisrael la'amim, ben Yom HaShvi l'sheshet yimei ha'maseh. We end Shabbos by making separations. And that's like the two sides of a triangle. But we have to understand that when we're going through periods of darkness, inside the darkness is the seed of a new light. That if we get caught in the darkness and we only relate that there's light and there's darkness, then we, in a sense, we get caught in a dualistic, bipolar world. So what's the healing for this? In a sense, is Shema. Hashem Echad. And how do we experience that oneness of God? Not only do we close our eyes, but we cover our eyes. And this is teaching us not to give up faith, not to give up trust. Just because I'm going through a hard time now, I don't have to fall apart. That this exile, this darkness, this challenge will be followed by a redemption and by light. And so if we start seeing our challenges, which we might relate to as being dark, we can turn it into light. That's our challenge, is to turn darkness into a darkness that shines for us, where we turn obstacles into opportunities. We turn challenges into opportunities to shine, to overcome. And this is a constant challenge. And that's what life is. Life is a challenge. And so, again, it's very paradoxical because there are times that we need to separate between darkness and light. But there's other times where we need to see that within darkness, there's great light. All the examples, saying the Shema in hiding our eyes during Birchat Koanim, in closing our eyes during prayer, of when we go to the mikvah of closing our eyes, when meditating, and when kissing. All of these are examples of where we actually seek out the darkness, because that darkness is actually light. So we should all be blessed to turn our obstacles and challenges into opportunities to triumph. Okay, thank you.